Good afternoon. My name is Rob Keim. I'm the priest or rector at St. Barnabas Episcopal Church down here in Arroyo Grande. We're the southern entrance to the Diocese of El Camino Real. I am part of the truth-telling task force, of which David Howard Pitney, also on here today, is the lead. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into how you and your parish can be doing some historical research using some simple tools like ancestry.com, how you can do historical research into your parish or church's history with the native and indigenous peoples in the area. Since we are part of the church organization, let us start with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with
Also
you.
with you.
Let us pray. God, you call us to be your church, and that is a great joy. Sometimes we get it beautifully well done, and sometimes we stumble. Help us recognize where we have created beauty and reflected that back out into the world, and help us understand where we may have caused harm. Help us understand the history of our churches. In Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Back in 2022, there were several of us that attended General Convention of the Episcopal Church. General Convention at that point accepted a report that looked at our church's history with several different ethnic groups or historic groups here in the United States and beyond. Several of those reports, and thus several of the resolutions for General Convention, were about understanding our church's history with Native and Indigenous peoples. And some of us then came back from General Convention and brought a resolution to our diocesan convention asking us to do just that work, where we're to do a forensic audit of our church's history with Native and Indigenous peoples. As we started doing that work, we found that that history was a bit deeper with the older parishes that we have in the Diocese of El Camino Real, parishes that predate by quite a long period the creation of our diocese, since we used to be part of the Diocese of California. As we were doing that research, we also found that there were some tools that were better for us to use, like ancestry.com, like census records, newspaper records. And so what we're going to do today is a deeper dive into those resources using two of our experts that we have here in the diocese. I'm going to let Jim and David introduce themselves respectively. Jim and David, I understand you're both historians. Is that right, Jim?
I reckon we are. I'm a local historian. I taught history at Mission Prep in San Luis Obispo and my alma mater, Arroyo Grande High School, for 30 years. And I have written 5 books on San Luis Obispo County and Arroyo Grande history.
Good. And David, who are you?
I'm a mostly retired history instructor at De Anza College in Cupertino. I still teach occasionally. Yeah, I am I went to graduate school in history, so I'm a trained historian. I actually mainly study African American rhetoric and back in historical leaders. But I'm here today. Well, in part, I'm probably here because I was a historian, because I'm still trying to figure out how I got asked to be on this truth-telling commission. But I am here today because I'm on the truth-telling task force that, as Rob described, and even more mysterious than how I got on it is how I became its chair. But I'm trying to shoulder that burden as best I can. I'm very pleased to be here today and share with you what I think is this very important work we're called as our diocese to do, and in our individual churches as well.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jim. Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you have some slides that you're going to share.
Yeah, let me start the share screen and go full screen. And are we on the same page here?
We are.
St. Barnabas. I'm
Yep.
also the president of the Historical Society. So in order to placate them and please them, to let them know I'm actually doing my job, I put our logo on there too. And there is my home parish, St. Barnabas. Unlike what my older brother said that I looked, the baptismal font is not correct from my baptism. So I just wanted to establish that. Starting point for me has to be a book I read when I was 19 or 20, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And at one point, the aftermath of the so-called Battle of Wounded Knee, 51 of the survivors were brought back to the Episcopal Chapel at the Pine Ridge Reservation and laid out on the floor underneath garlands and boughs and a huge sign that said, "Peace on earth, goodwill toward men." It was right after Christmas. That led to a chapter in a book I wrote about the Civil War, which included so-called Indian fighters who are buried in our local cemetery, including this one. This is the mayor's house on Myrtle Avenue. The man who built that house, tragically, on December 26th, 1862, witnessed the biggest mass execution in American history of 38 Sioux warriors in Mankato, Minnesota. So there are connections beyond the Episcopal Church, and some of them are pretty sobering. So it was Father Rob who got me started, and this is the original St. Barnabas from 1901. Today it's a Catholic mission in Oceano, nearby St. Francis. And he found a history of the church, which was another good starting point. And I also looked a little bit, I just love this church. St. Stephen's is just so beautiful. I did a little bit of research on the founders of St. Stephen's in San Luis Obispo. The real starting point, though, probably was a good place to start, is with a list of the St. Barnabas founders. That was kind of the springboard for the research that I did. And at least 4 of these people have streets named after them in my hometown of Rio Grande. They were all significant people. Just want to give you one example. This is the kind of person you might run across in your parish research. Clara Edwards Paulding. She was descended from Jonathan Edwards, who delivered that humdinger of a sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." So she always made sure to make clear that she was a descendant of the Puritan divines. This is her at Mills College in Oakland. She became a school teacher here. She taught school for over 40 years and was one of the founders of St. Barnabas. I knew her daughter, Ruth Paulding, for whom a local school was named. And there is Clara Edwards Paulding. At the base of the steps, she rode her bicycle to the rural branch school. The little fellow in the picture is me. I would enter that door 60 years after this photo was taken to begin my formal education. And here she is, right there. She was the organist and choir director for St. Barnabas. Here she is in front of the church. She was also the organist and choir director for the Methodist and the Presbyterian churches. So Clara was very ecumenical. So Rob mentioned ancestry.com. If you want to go into more detail about a particular founder, Clara would be a perfect example of that. It is a buy subscription service, but I found it invaluable in doing this project and in writing my books. I discovered that one family, the Turners, produced 4 lovely Turner daughters, all of whom married in St. Barnabas. So if Clara Dudley Edwards Paulding can be said to be a founder, so were the Turners. There were a bunch of little Turners. Another source of local historical societies, the South County Historical Society, which I'm president, has a lot of resources. Hard copies of old newspapers. They have genealogical records, photographic exhibits, unpublished papers, and I'm a map nut. They have early maps of the Rio Grande area and 4 museums. So if you're going to research your local parish, your local historical society might be invaluable. Since we're dealing with Indigenous people, there are several tribal websites. I have a handout in which there are some listed for folks north of San Luis Obispo County. But our people, the Northern Chumash, have a couple of websites. they call themselves, I'm going to try this, Yakticho Ticho Yaktilini, which basically means people of the moon. That's the proper name for the people we call the Northern Chumash. And the entire people extended from Malibu to northern San Luis Obispo County. Another source, more scholarly, I found at university archives, you can find graduate papers on local indigenous people. There's an example from our local university, Cal Poly. And another source, JSTOR, which is one I've used extensively. Again, it's a scholarly subscription service, but you will find literally hundreds of articles on California Native Americans. So a very important source. And I discovered we have a celebrity. So a little bit about her. I will be quiet for a moment, thankfully. And we're not dealing with extinct people. I had the great honor of teaching these two young women who are direct descendants of Rosario Cooper. Another avenue of research are newspapers, which thankfully have been digitized. I think the most important source is newspapers.com, which is, again, a subscription service, but it has literally hundreds of newspapers We had a lynching here, sadly, in Rio Grande in 1881. I found articles about it in newspapers in Scotland, and it's very user friendly. For me, it's the preferred source. But the California Digital Newspaper Collection focuses obviously on state newspapers. It has probably a deeper reach than newspapers.com. You can research by decade, by county, by name of an individual. The problem is it doesn't always work. It has a PDF function that they haven't quite worked the kinks out of yet. So I rarely use it. If you go into newspaper research, just a reminder, you don't have to go back to the 1860s or 1870s. Here's Clara Paulding again, looking unnaturally grumpy. And this is a newspaper from the 1930s. So don't neglect, if you're researching a particular person or a particular tribe, that some of that information doesn't have to go back to the 19th century. And another example, Dan Krieger is a local historian, one of my heroes. And a common theme in local indigenous history is the violation of Native American remains. Dan wrote in this column, somehow some Chumash skulls wound up in a medical college in Birmingham, England. In many instances, grave sites are simply evaporated. A water main was laid in downtown San Luis Obispo in 1891 near the old mission, where there were hundreds of Chumash burials. No one knows what happened to the remains of those people. The two articles on the right are from the Rio Grande newspaper in the 1930s. And this is where we run into a problem. One of the people who committed an act like this was an Episcopal pastor in the 1880s from St. Stephen's. He was an amateur archaeologist, and he evidently gave his collection to a friend, and somehow those Native American remains wound up in England as well. This kind of thing hasn't gone away either. I found this on eBay from a fellow in Oregon. You can buy this set for $400, and here's the way he described them. I'm sorry, I was a newspaper journalist before I became a history teacher. So I kind of pine for the old days when newspapers were big. But when you go to newspapers.com, see if you can't find a local history columnist. Dan Krieger, as I mentioned, for San Luis Obispo County, and this wonderful woman, the late Jean Hubbard, for my hometown, Rio Grande, California. And you can find some great secondary sources from local historians. The books are less useful. They're either aimed at juvenile audiences or very, very scholarly types. But the trick is to look at the back. A book may not seem worthwhile, but its end matter, particularly its works cited and its bibliography, I consider those poachable. And they've often led me to better and sometimes primary sources about a topic that I'm researching. There were obviously, we now know more about them. There were Native American schools throughout the United States and Canada. They have a tragic history. A few of them were Episcopalian. If you want to find out more about them, there is an interactive map that you can find online. And if you click on the symbols, the identity of the school will pop up for you. I was not able, and thankfully so far, to connect any of the founding clergy for either St. Barnabas or St. Stephen's with the staffs of any of the Episcopal Native American schools. But we did have a Native American school that took Northern Chumash people, and it was in Riverside, the Sherman Indian School. Here's a brief video about a woman who attended that. So they were dispossessed twice, once from their own land and once by the Navajo. I am fond of sports, so I will allow myself this little bit of information. The famous Carlisle Indian School, that's Dwight Eisenhower. In 1912, Army played Carlisle, and in trying to tackle Jim Thorpe, the future president of the United States, injured his knee, and Carlisle won going away. Good for you, Jim Thorpe. Another source for research is studies done by municipalities. There are a couple of examples here. The one in the center, that's a farmland just below St. Barnabas, East Cherry Avenue. And it was studied in preparation for housing development there. Several Native American artifacts were found and cataloged and described. Bridge Street as well, which is in the heart of Older Royal. We do not call it the village in my family because Smurfs live in villages. Another potential source is national organizations like the Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Forest Service. The Los Padres National Forest is now called the Chumash Wilderness. And these are extensive historical research studies done on the area to the east of us. Now, going back to ancestry, we mentioned the census. And in 1860 and 1870, as you can see from this page, individuals are identified by race. I say the surnames are an enigma because I don't know if in the tradition of African-American slavery, some people adopted their master's surnames. So I don't know if these people did the same or if they were actually family members. It's unclear to me. But the notation near the top, servant, David can speak more to that because it was very likely that Native Americans would be, I guess the word is drafted into involuntary servitude in California from the 1850s on. Now to navigate, let me kind of walk you through it. We'll go search, here's my Irish ancestors. Go to census and voter lists. And then we want the US federal census collection. Okay, we don't want an individual. We want an aggregate, so view all collections. And let's go to 1860. Click on that. And I've pre-selected California, San Luis Obispo County. I'm going to choose not stated for the areas outside San Luis Obispo City. The first page that comes up is boring, but we hit pay dirt already on page 2. Oh gosh, what have I gotten you into? Who can read that? Well, we have the categories up above, and thankfully, the nice folks at ancestry.com, if you go down to the bottom, those names have been transcribed, so they're readable. So let's kind of go down the list and see if we can find any Native Americans. And bingo, Montico family, we find 2 servants, both male. Mr. Montico at the top, who is evidently the head of the household, is a farmer born in Mexico, worth $100. Not bad in 1860. And a little bit farther down, we find another example. A Native American servant attached to a family named the Saviolas. And Guadalupe Saviolas, the apparent head of household, is quite a bit wealthier than his counterpart. The other things to look for on the left are the dwelling number and the family number. You can determine that all of these people named Saviola actually lived under the same roof. That makes it more likely that the whole family may have been servants. Go to another page just because I like it. This is in the North County, and we find a group of Native Americans, likely servants, named the Sox. They lived right next door to Drury Woodson James, who was the uncle of Frank and Jesse James, who lived in San Luis Obispo County for a year in 1868-69. An extremely wealthy man, personal estate value, $15,400. So the likelihood that he had servants is very strong. This is old Mission San Luis Obispo. It's a beautiful plaza today, but this is about 1860. I was able to find about 40 individuals who were identified as Indian. Then I went up to David's neighborhood, San Jose All Saints, much bigger population, 3,500. To my dismay, only 14 people were identified as Indian. There was essentially a war of extermination carried out against the Ohlone people. And that's probably the explanation for that. Those who survived settled in the East Bay, where at least one of them was replaced by a Hearst family, bought a ranch that is now a country club, $10,000 a year membership. Thank you very much. There are going to be interactions between Native Americans and the law. And that's another thing to look for. A good point that David brought up. If in your research, if you can ascertain whether any sheriffs or judges belong to your parish, there's a strong likelihood that they had some kind of interaction with Native Americans. As Anatole France once said, the law in its majestic equality condemns both the rich and the poor for stealing bread and sleeping under bridges. Again, go back to university archives. Cal Poly has a collection of jail records, including mugshots of individuals as far back as the 19th century. There's a strong likelihood that some of those may have been Native Americans. And California State Library, you can find booking photos of inmates who were admitted to either San Quentin or Folsom Prison. This man from San Diego County will be executed. Another way to look, are there any connections between your parish and state representatives? The California Law for Governance and Protection of Indians, David is more conversant with than I am, but it's one of the ways that enabled white people to essentially appropriate Indians, especially young ones, I gather, and use them as indentured servants. Our state assemblyman was out of town the day that law was passed, that lucky rascal. He accepted a judgeship in San Luis Obispo County, but then he drowned, so it goes. His name was Henry Teft. We have a street named after him in Nipomo. I haven't, and for that, I'm thankful. I want to keep researching, and I want, as Rob has suggested, I want to look for the other side of the coin. I'm sure I can find examples of kindness and support for Native Americans, but we do have one ancestor connected to a very tragic story in California history. I think the grandfather of one of St. Barnabas founders. The man in the center is named George Nidover. He tried ranching east of Arroyo Grande until he killed his 200th grizzly bear. And then he said, I'm not going to do that anymore, and moved to Santa Barbara. Nidover is connected with the woman on the right. Her name was Juana Maria. She was the woman of San Nicolas Island in the Channel Islands. Her people were wiped out by Russian and Aleut fur trappers, and she was left alone. Nidover found her, brought her back to Santa Barbara. And it was then that the St. Barnabas ancestor offered him $1,000 if Nidover would allow him to put Juana Maria on display in San Francisco. To his credit, Nidover refused. And shortly after, Juana Maria died. She was not immune to the diseases of local mission Indians, but she's buried with the Nidover family. And of course, she became the basis for the award-winning juvenile novel, Island of the Blue Dolphins. So that's a start. I've got a ways to go. And as I said, I want to see if I can't find information of a more positive and affirming nature. But it is fascinating. Whether you find anything or not in your research, you're going to meet some really interesting people.
Thank you, Jim. I've got a couple questions for you before we move over to David. And first of all, a comment. We do have a subscription to ancestry.com that is
Great.
available for those of you in the Diocese of El Camino Real that are doing research on your parishes and the people in your parishes. We do have that subscription available to you. You can contact me at rob.stbarnabas@gmail.com. That's rob.stbarnabas@gmail.com. Again, that's a subscription that we're making available on ancestry.com to anyone who's doing research here in the Diocese of El Camino Real, research on their churches and the founders or the people in their churches. Jim, you also shared newspaper.com. How does someone get access to that?
Same thing that Rob, you can just probably buy a group subscription to that as well, I would guess.
Very good.
And those two, Ancestry and newspapers.com, hand in hand, are just really a good source, two good sources rather.
You mentioned a lot of other resources. Are those available online? And if so, are they free? Or do you actually have to register or pay a subscription?
JSTOR is the scholarly compendium requires a subscription. Most of the others don't, though. It's also possible, if you really want to do an even deeper dive, you can go to your local university and ask for a library card, which will give you free access to all of their resources. Poly does that, for example, as well.
Good, thank you.
And they have a wonderful archives department that's very helpful for local history.
Does anyone else have a question for Jim before we move over to David? Take it away, David.
Okay, well, let me share my screen. Well, actually, let me say a little bit before I do that. First of all, I'm in awe of what Jim can achieve and all the resources and knowledge he commands. If you're like me, don't be intimidated, though. You don't need to do nearly as much. It's great if you can, but you can do some significant, helpful research for our task force's purposes and to find out about relations between early founding Episcopalians of our area and the native peoples there. You can get a lot of it done just on ancestry.com, perhaps with a few additional ones, but I myself just got onto ancestry.com in a matter of weeks ago and find it usable. And like everything else, you get a little better at it, over time and experimenting. Okay, let's go to share screen. Okay. So what we're asking people to do, especially people who are non-professional historians like Jim is to start with your own church's records and archives. Almost always, I believe, there is a church historian or somebody assigned in that position. So start there. And they're often valuable. Church records, they're variable. You don't know how much there is. I find they're probably most reliably useful for getting the names of early founders of a parish. They often have some further biographical information for prominent persons, high achievers of early members of their church. But unfortunately, for the purposes of this truth-telling task force regarding Native Americans, they contain little, in fact, usually nothing about Native Americans. So we have to go beyond your local church records. There's a need for further investigation to try to fill that hole of knowledge about what transpired between Native Americans and those early Episcopalians. So start with church records, but don't end there. But they're a great place to use a springboard, the names and lists of people you've been able to do some more research on. And you can probably do 90% plus of that, at least of a good start, on ancestry.com. And Jim showed you a little bit how to manipulate that. And Rob just said generously is providing access to an account for ancestry.com for anybody who's doing it. Ancestry.com includes, as we just watched with Jim, census records and access to old newspapers, but we can also supplement those things from other sources. Okay, so what our task force is asking of parish researchers to help us fulfill this is to identify early church members. We're primarily looking around 1840 to 1910 or so. We're interested to learn of the names of any and all parishioners. Especially helpful would be people who were leaders in the early congregation and any significant donors. We would like to ask to definitely use the census records. Look up some of those early individuals' census records. And anything you might find there of interest that it all tells us about something with Native Americans. But what we're primarily hoping to find is evidence of Indian servants of these folks. And unfortunately, as Jim just showed us, only the 1860 and 1870 censuses in California listed by race. But the other suggestive tip would be the presence of Hispanic names for people who are farmhands or house servants, etc. Native peoples coming out of missions had Hispanic Christian names, and since these historic 1800s times right up to the present, some Native American people choose to identify as Mexican or Hispanic because Indian is often sadly seen as the lowest social category to be in. As the records tend to do themselves in church archives, an extra focus would be helpful on public officials, such as state legislators, mayors, and various office holders, and judges of any and all kinds. Justices of the peace are particularly of interest to the task force for reasons I'll get into. Early California laws and policies were tremendously damaging to Indian peoples. There was a study commissioned by the state of California a decade or two back called Early California Laws and Policies Towards Indians. That is just a great source of knowledge about the laws and other policies that were so harmful. It's a PDF. I can send it to anybody who contacts me who desires it. We're interested in legislators in particular because of their role. So, for example, Indians were not granted voting rights in early California. That was a decision starting with the 1849 California Constitutional Convention. Then very shortly after, and there's a now functioning state government, one of their earliest acts in statutes was to clarify that Indians and some other non-whites could not testify in court, certainly could not testify against whites in court, which left them with virtually a total lack of legal and political rights with which to defend themselves in California. They had almost no legal recourse or protection against abuse. Many whites could and did mistreat them with impunity, with no consequence. Elected officials were not beholden at all to Indians, since Indians were not any of their constituents or could vote. And then state policy, maybe most notoriously, anti-Indian expeditions, punitive expeditions that state government often authorized and funded. I guess most famously, Governor Burnett's, our first governors, getting through the legislature, bounties for Indian scalps. These wars, militias, were out and out genocidal with many massacres. So it would be of great interest to us all in pursuing the truth. Were there individual Episcopalian lawmakers who spoke for or against, voted for or against such measures? One particularly damaging, in my opinion, abominable act, again, one of the first laws passed in the first session of the California legislature, was an act for the governance and protection of Indians. And the word protection in there is a complete misnomer. The effect of this law was to facilitate removal of California Indians from their traditional lands, separating Native children and adults for at least a generation from their families and cultures, and indenturing mostly indigenous children as well as adults to whites. Californians were in such a hurry to pass this kind of measure that Congress had not yet even ratified our statehood before the legislature had passed these laws. Sections of that Indian Act provided such things as white persons could apply to their justice of the peace to have removed Indians from lands in said whites' possession. White persons could go before a justice of the peace to obtain Indian children to become apprentices or indentured servants. A white person could bring an Indian before a justice of the peace and declare claims, that they were vagrant, that is, without means of support, or even living a grossly immoral lifestyle. Such things were written in the law. And the judge could make that Indian the white's bound servant, that is, apprenticed or indentured unpaid servant. Keep in mind that Indians could not testify. So basically, a judge, a magistrate, had the position of this white. The Indian could not say yay or nay or speak up for themselves. And unless there happened to be, a local white person who wanted to get involved and say something in the natives' favor, that did not happen. The justices of the peace were empowered to make these decisions for townships and municipalities. There were also some county courts of session. Justices of the peace or other judges had near total discretion in deciding such matters. Sometimes there were auctions held at jails for vagrant Indians. And while we're talking about the mid-1800s, a colleague of mine, well, he's here on the Zoom, Jerry, reminded me that just yesterday that the Episcopal Public Policy Network is urging members to lobby Congress now to abolish slavery as it still exists in the prison system. So some of this has been going on a long time, and versions of it still going on. we've come up with a strategy of places to look that could potentially link early Episcopalians, particularly those of political clout and significance, with these early policies that were so harmful to Native Californian people. So legislators who may have spoken out for in debates or voted for these measures, their fingerprints would be all over them. Or, as we might hope or report if we see it, perhaps there's an Episcopalian state legislator who argued against these measures and declared them unjust. Who knows what we may find? Then there, of course, were the judges who they didn't create these laws and policies, but who implemented them and effectuated those policies. Again, remembering that the labor system of early California Indians was a coerced, non-free labor supply. It's so far I have learned that it is hard to find direct linkage between individuals and these anti-Indian policies. That's why we're actively working on it. I'm lucky to have a friend and colleague, Lisa Christensen, who works at De Anza College in its California History Center. She's the librarian archivist of that center. And she's working with me. We're hopeful we're going to solve that puzzle for some individuals. But if I already could do it and knew how to do it, I would be urging you to go ahead and try that on your own. But instead, I'm going to ask you to send to me so we can centralize the individual legislators and judges. So I'll just give you one example of how close, but not as definitive as we'd like it to be. There was one Elisha Oscar Crosby, an Episcopalian whose family went on to be very active in our diocese. And he was at the 1849 State Constitutional Convention that decided, among other things, to deny voting privileges to Native peoples. He didn't join in the debate. There was a pretty thoroughgoing debate about whether Indians should or shouldn't be granted voting privileges. He said not a word on that topic. And to me, more maddeningly yet, there was no, at least that I could find in the primary record, no roll call vote on its adoption. Rather, it was just stated that it was passed on the last day of the legislature. So don't know, he didn't say anything in favor or against it. And we have so far found no actual record of how he voted. So that's a challenging issue, but we haven't given up. So just to recapitulate what we're asking parish resources to let us know about is, of course, starting with getting the names and information that your own records have about early Episcopalians. All right, asking you to specifically look at census forms for those people. We are, for whatever they'll reveal, we are particularly interested in any evidence or suggestions of Episcopalians having Indian servants, since that was such an exploitive labor arrangement. We ask you to send in your names, excuse me, not yours, and information about elected officials and public officials in general. Of course, obviously, we'd ask you to be as specific as you can. If you can say Mr. X held this office where and from when to when, that's great, but by all means, however fragmentary, send us whatever information you have. Ditto, send us names and information about as much information as you have about just judges, particularly justices of the peace. It's do or die is a little too dramatic. It's time to be at task on this. Going backwards from the November Diocesan Convention that we will be reporting to, when those reports have to be turned in a month or 2 months in advance, we're estimating that to really be substantially reflected in our report, information that parish researchers are supplying to us will need to be in our hands by pretty early May. So what that leaves us with maybe up to 10 weeks from today to get this done. So we please ask you to send any information you have about these individuals and a list of them to me, Howard Pitney at Comcast.net. There's my phone number as well. So God bless you. We'd appreciate anything you can do. I would like to say that I do not regard this as just a typical human activity we are involved in. I think it's central to our Christian calling to reach out to the poor and to the dispossessed. Native peoples, the indigenous peoples of our diocese and throughout our country, were definitely severely wronged people. Their numbers were decimated, their homelands lost and taken, subject to massacres and continuing trauma across time to the present with their survivors. These truth-telling commissions are trying to own up to some of the truth and acknowledge whatever role our forebears may have had in this. Not to dwell on the negative, but to be able to move past it, to be able to bring about potential reconciliation, to establish right relationships with the survivors who are still living with us as our neighbors, to get to know them and try to help repair some of the damage done. But we can't tell the truth, can't present facts that we don't have. So we're asking your help to help us find at least part of that truth. We are engaged in holy work to find as much of the truth as we can and to tell it. Over to whoever's next. Oh,
David, if you would stop sharing.
thank you.
David, I do have one question before I open it up to others to
Certainly.
ask questions as well. You've said that this is information that we're gathering in the 1800s. While many of our parishes were established, like mine, in 1901, so in the 1900s, is it still worth doing this type of research for legislators, judges, census records? Is it still worth doing it in the 20th century as well?
I know so little about Native American history in the 20th century. I could not give a definitive answer to that. I imagine so. One of the things that we recommend more recently established churches do is to learn about the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral homelands your church now resides. Learn and educate yourself about those people, and through such things as potential land acknowledgements that your parish may be moved to adopt, to use that as a tool to open dialogue with remaining indigenous people who are our neighbors, whether descendants of the original people for your area or whoever your Native American neighbors are these days. The other thing I would urge you to do is let us not, of course, me too. We all first and foremost identify with the church we attend almost, every Sunday. But I urge us to remember we're members of a collection of churches, of a diocese. And if your church is not, because being so recent, its own records are not going to be all that full or helpful about learning about Native Americans, I urge you to help join the research teams of the older, more historical established churches. We need many hands to uncover and find those kinds of things. I myself am researching a church that is not my own. So I would recommend you join in the research anyhow, or at least do within your church what's more appropriate than for the older churches.
Thank you, David. Anyone else have any questions for David or Jim about the research that we're looking to have done? Before I hit end to the recording, not end to the meeting, but end to the recording, I do want to reemphasize what David just said, that, as followers of Jesus, we are called to understand what our churches have done, both good and bad, what we've done in our histories, because we are here to help with healing in the world and mirroring God's love back out into the world. And what we have done over the last 150 years is part of the way that we inform how we mirror God's love back out into the world. So if available, if you could turn any information into David, or come to me to get an ancestry.com login, turn that in by the early May, then we can get working on the reports that are due in early autumn for our November diocesan convention. Thank you to David, and thank you to Jim for all the work that you've done to put this together. And I'm going to hit end to the recording.